Good morning, everyone. So, on reflection, I decided to revisit one of my characters from yesterday in a slightly different way. Marina Hoffman wrote this article about retelling the Agar story and reading through the trauma in Genesis 16. Now, Marina had a motor vehicle accident. She and her husband in Toronto on the Highway 69, and somehow the crash was very fatal for the driver who really hit them, and she suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, and she suffered a brain injury and experienced significant physical injuries and continued to face a long road to recovery. So she had a traumatic experience, and she started to look at the story of Abraham and in Genesis 16 of Sarah, Agar, and Abraham's, and stories in the Bible through traumatic lenses because of the trauma she was going through. So let's look at this story from what we've been talking about, chronic shame and trauma. So now, when we read Genesis 16, the story of Sarah and Agar and Abraham, and the events preceding the birth of Ishmael, was not just a one of shame and it was traumatic in their lives. And as I reflect on what to talk about this morning, somehow I feel the need to unpack the story as I talk about chronic shame and trauma. Because shame brings a lot of traumatic encounters in our lives. And trauma doesn't have to be something big and minor. It can be little things that builds up over a time. It's how the person, it comes across to the person. So when we read Genesis 16, we see the story of Sarah, Agar, and Abraham, and the events preceding the birth of Ishmael. One can understand the frustration and the anger exhibited by Sarah. As you look at the story and the struggles, you felt that she kind of feel an inability to conceive and realize that her plans for the future may not be fulfilled as she had planned. I can only empathize with Abraham, who is directly impacted by Sarah's infertility and abuse of Agar, and it does not know how to make the situation right or how to remove Sarah's suffering. As we look at the life of Abraham, we can see that he was a character in, even though he became God called him his friend, God had to work on Abraham's character traits because he, contrary to what a lot of people believe, that the Bible society is more matriarchal than we believe. We tend to believe it is. So Sarah, with to some extent, with what we say we wear the pants in modern day society, or Abraham would give in to Sarah's advice without standing up as the male, as we try to portray things in society. So having been through my own experiences and encounters, and sometimes little things in our lives become so traumatic to us. I mean, just having a surgery can be traumatic. It just depends on how you do look at certain things in life. It can be a traumatic encounter. Just going to doctors constantly and just overwhelming things in life can be traumatic in our lives. So why does Sarah abuse Agar when her plan to have a child through Agar seemingly seems to be a success? That was a tickling. Sorry about that. That was a tickling moment. So I asked the question, why would it seems to be so traumatic when it seems to be a success? What makes Sarah so angry? Why does Agar run away and then return to Sarah? And finally, how can we understand the roles of Abraham and the community in this story? You see, from our own traumatic experience, we can be convinced that actions of Sarah and Agar are consistent with the response of trauma victims and people of shame, and that this lens may also help to explain the responses of Abraham and the community also. So trauma theory is a relatively new science, and it emerges out of experiences of soldiers in Vietnam War. Although the effects of a wide range of traumatic experience have since been studied, we still have much to learn about the impact of infertility and the shame that comes with it and the abuse and the refugee experience. When we face a challenge that the biblical text gives us the limited information, moreover, evaluating the effects of trauma and shame presented in this challenge, the impact of trauma are highly subjective and individualized. Everyone responds to trauma and shame and suffering differently, depending on how they have been prepared for the trauma or shame beforehand. For example, some people develop good coping mechanisms to minor traumatic situations during their life and are better prepared to deal with trauma and shame, major traumas than others. Even so, there are distinct symptoms that apply in varying degrees to all trauma victims. Trauma produces fear, anger, anxiety, and irritability. Trauma produces feelings of despair and hopelessness. One's ordered world is lost and unpredictable, and unplanned responses of flight. A major element of our own trauma experiences and our own shameful encounters is a continual effort to defeat these negative feelings, to overcome the anger and frustration that erupts in expected ways, and to cultivate a hope outlook for the future. Now, as we look at the Bible passage, and we're going to examine Sarah as a trauma victim and the shame that she encountered. Now, our first glimpse of Sarah comes in a long passage about the genealogy of Abraham. In that passage, we only learn one thing about Sarah, that she's barren and childless. Now, can you imagine the shame of being described as being barren and childless, especially in our culture? To read that in Genesis 11, verse 29 to 30. So we later read of her beauty, which is the occasion for complex problems involving her husband, lies to Pharaoh. Can you imagine how she feels, wondering why he just pawns her off like this, and the shame of, living the lie that, oh, yes, I'm beautiful, but I can't do the one thing in my life that I want to do is to give birth. And the fact that, my husband keep pawning me off to cover his skin all the time. So later Abimelech, and we read the divine promise given to Abraham concerning his offspring. Now, all of it is Sarah's infertility and the seemingly endless delays of the divine promise, which is again emphasized at the beginning of chapter 16, that seems to form the crisis of her story. Contrary to experiences that can pinpoint at a particular moment in time, Sarah's infertility is not a traumatic moment. It is instead a gradual realization and acceptance that she will not have a child, the shame of her society around her, and living with the knowing that God had promised Abraham an heir, and that she was up in age. Now, scholars today argue that reproductive problems tax a woman's innest resource to a great degree, and thus they are more among the most serious life stresses a woman can experience. And contemporary psychological research indicate that infertility has deep, lasting effects on a woman's well-being. Now, Sarah may have struggled with these same stresses, like many women today who view biological parenthood as necessary for happiness and the fulfillment of family goals. It is likely that Sarah's experience of infertility was an ongoing trauma, an ongoing shame she had to deal with. Now, moreover, the experience of infertility in the ancient Near East without the fertility options we can access today may have exacerbated Sarah's trauma. In a culture where childbirth is necessary for survival, Sarah has to contend with the social pressure to bear children, the shame of the nation and the people around her, wondering, why didn't she have any children? They're so wealthy. God seems to be with them. What is wrong with Sarah? Certainly it's not Abraham. It must be her. So Sarah must relive the ongoing pain and shame of her infertility every day and come to terms with what she assumes to be an abnormality of her body. And then she faces additional disappointment that her childlessness has left Abraham divine promises unfulfilled. Sarah was carrying all these burdens and shame, traumatized by the fact that, hey, he's not going to be the father of the nation because of me. Moreover, the experience of infertility in the ancient Near Eastern, as I said, without the fertility option makes it even harder. So Sarah's speech in Genesis 16 reveals her keen sense of personal and spiritual responsibility, for she described God as having prevented her from having children, as many people see today. Now, how is Abraham to be the father of a great nation if Sarah will not give him a child? The unfulfilled divine promise and all the expectation, because remember, God promised him this child, and years passed by before this child came to be. So in Sarah's mind, okay, is God laughing at me? Maybe, and I'm not sure what she's thinking. If Sarah will not give him a child, the unfulfilled divine promise and all the expectation, at one point even Abraham thought, am I going to have it through Eliezer, my servant? So they start to think, maybe God is not, as we often do, we try to reason into a situation. Maybe God's going to fulfill this promise indirectly. The unfulfilled divine promise, and expectations that it created surely made Sarah's journey to accept her infertility and all the move difficult, painful, shameful, and traumatic, as it requires Sarah to surrender the experience and hope that she will participate directly in fulfilling the divine message given to Abraham. As in our society today, men just go out and get one, which is not right, but that's what they do. In the biblical text, we are not told how Sarah comes to accept her infertility and involuntary childlessness, but her ensuing action provided some insight. Sarah offers her servant Hagar to Abraham as a way of Abraham and Sarah to build a family. She was okay with the concept, happy to go the surrogate way, rather than returning to the hope of bearing a child herself or renewing her trust that God will give her a child through her own body. Now, Sarah abandons those possibilities and finds a new way of coping. She transfers her hope to Hagar. This transference of hope though, is complicated and fraught with these difficulties, bring more shame and more trauma to the situation. This is chronic shame and chronic trauma. It is tremendous difficulty to let go the hope of someday and somebody somehow. And I imagine that Sarah had struggles and she contemplated this decision to have a surrogate. It wasn't an easy choice to decide to share your husband with somebody else. Now, when Agar became pregnant, and it's not like today where she could just produce an egg and Agar produce a sperm and they come together and she becomes a surrogate without having a sexual encounter. In those days, they had a sexual encounter. So when Agar became pregnant, we might think that Sarah would celebrate. Our goal of having a family is finally being realized. However, a new challenge arises when Agar's response to the pregnancy is to despise Sarah, just like ladies do today. Angered at the response, Sarah blames Abraham and then produces some anger and abuse towards Agar. Now, we don't have the details of Sarah's abusive behavior, but her response reflects a typical response to the traumatic experience of infertility coupled with childlessness, a response of anger, frustration, and violence. And I suspect that Sarah's negative reaction to the success of Agar's pregnancy is also linked to her own pain. Now, even before the birth, Agar's growing belly is a visible reminder to Sarah that she cannot bear children and that her natural role is being filled by another who is giving her attitude in her own space and home and taking her husband as her home. Now, she doesn't only want to have a one-off relationship, she wants Abraham every night. Now, Agar's pregnancy acts as a public confirmation of Sarah's painful reality and her decision to procreate through other means. It is a threat to her way of life and sense of self. And so when Agar shows resentment towards Sarah, it upsets Sarah's equilibrium. This is one part of the life that comes to taint all our experiences, spoiling our appreciation of the present and overwhelming our capacity to respond to Agar with reasonableness and appropriate measures. Through Sarah, we see that trauma affects the way an individual feels about herself and the world around her. Commonly, the victim of traumatic experience loses sight of meaning in suffering and is no longer able to see its purpose. The feeling that the pain, betrayal, and loss are meaningless is one of the painful lessons that the trauma brings, and the shame the victim often feels God-forsaken and betrayed by others. And in this case, she was betrayed by Agar. Usually, suffering does not bring the increased sense of love and meaning, but rather it results in loneliness, shame, and disintegration of belief. Like Sarah, victims of trauma come to the view God has been against them. And then many are being punished. And the many victims reenact their trauma by traumatizing those around them. Hurt people hurt people. This is not surprising. Irritability, anger, and violence are normal responses to shame and trauma as victims fight to remain in control. And this is precisely the response we see in Sarah's subsequent victimization of Agar. So let us look at Agar through trauma lenses as a trauma victim. In our encounter with the narratives of those who have undergone significant trauma, we often find that traumas cluster together. When one person experiences trauma, others do as well. In this case, we don't have to look very far from the trauma of Sarah and Agar as Egyptian servant who lived with Sarah. So Agar leaves her household, which is traumatic in itself. Before our story begins, Agar has been taken from her Egyptian home to Sarah's household in Canaan. She has already been uprooted from her former society, her identity, her place, her family and support system. This initial journey from Egypt to Sarah's household may have caused Agar physical and psychological distress. Her social standing as Sarah's slave placed Agar in a role of powerlessness, new strength in this environment. Resiliency and independence, for example, the impact of leaving one's home does not disappear. It disrupts one's very identity and one's and feeling of belongingness. In its introduction of her character, the scriptural text thus position us as the reader to encounter Agar as a lonely outsider who is far from home, a person seemingly on the margin of narrative Genesis itself. A second and more obvious disruption of Agar's identity comes by way of her involuntary surrogacy. When she discovers she's pregnant, Agar assumes a new identity. Agar is now in a position of power as mother of Abraham's child. Her pregnancy presents a transition from a state of powerlessness as she can now look forward to a future that holds some promise, purpose, and meaning. So she no longer wants to be the servant, she wants to be the wife. It is not surprising then that Agar develops arrogance in her newfound identity and that she comes to despise Sarah. Like Sarah, Agar transitioned from victim to victimizer. Now, Agar reinforces Sarah's pain and shame of infertility by contemptuously lording over Sarah the fact that while Sarah is infertile, Agar is now bearing Abraham's heir and offspring in her mind. Agar's hope for a future of promise and purpose, though it's dashed, her assumed identity as powerful is proven false, and she is caught up in a cycle of oppression and victimhood as Sarah reacts to Agar's pregnancy with abuse. And in my mind, Sarah started to abuse Agar once Agar became arrogant. I could be wrong. But Agar's basic rights to protection and safety are violated by the very family that was responsible for her well-being. And Abraham sits silently and says nothing. And in this helplessness position, there are scant possibilities of resistance. And so despite lacking the necessities for survival in the wilderness, she decided to flee. In the midst of Agar crisis, a divine messenger appears. When this angel meets the wandering Agar, asks where she's going. Agar only indicates that she's fleeing her mistress. She gives the angel no specific destination. She seems aimless and unprepared for the journey. This flight is characteristic of many trauma victims who give little thought to the consequences of their flight, which puts them in increased risk of more trauma and shame. Agar's response reminds us how we have struggled to find a place where we feel safe, where we can escape. After our own incidents and traumas, we're driven to leave everything we know in our hometown and to start a new life, new places, new experiences. Eventually, we move around feeling hopelessness until we find somewhere we can settle. Perhaps Agar felt a similar instinctively. When Agar flees, she does so as a lone woman, a single parent, who is culturally and ethnically distinct from those around her. This exacerbates her flight, making it less likely that she will be able to successfully resettle among another group. And so when Agar is visited by the divine messenger, she faces a difficult choice to return home or to seek asylum elsewhere. Now, the angel connects with Agar on a personal level, calling her by name. This simple act has profound implication, as so far in the biblical text, only the narrator has addressed Agar directly. Sarah and Abraham have simply referred to her as a servant. Thus, by calling Hagar's name, the angel bestows a sense of value and worth upon Agar. She's not an anonymous being, but an individual with an identity again. The angel instructs Agar to return to Sarah and the setting of her mistreatment. Some readers take umbrage at this angelic injunction, for indeed returning to Sarah may have meant continued abuse for Agar. Like many who have experienced trauma, however, Agar's most immediate need is for a place of safety, security, and stability. In the wilderness, Agar is vulnerable to a far worse future than what she may find with Abraham and Sarah. More broadly, we might read this directive as suggestive of the importance of victims integrating back into their communities after traumatic experience. The angel then gave Agar a divine promise and offered her the hope of a better future. Like Abraham, Agar is told that she will have many descendants. She's also told that she will carry her pregnancy to full term and then give birth to a son, a promise of hope in the midst of wilderness and despair and shame. While Agar often found herself in a situation of vulnerability and abuse, she's told that her son will be independent and free to live away from this community. Perhaps most importantly, the angel affirms that Yahweh has heard Agar's cry of affliction. The angel acknowledged Agar's trauma and assures that God has not abandoned her or disregarded the servant girl. The profound impact of this divine comfort on Agar is reflected in her response. Agar names God as the one who has seen her. There is no doubt that Agar's experiences both the trauma and the shame of humbling herself and going back to her master's house, and the divine intervention and affirmation changes Agar. In facing her reality, Agar is able to begin again to live in the present, starting not from the beginning, but from the point which her life was disjointed. We may be uncomfortable that the angel sends Agar back to her abuser. We may want a fair and just world where the angel will intervene in Agar's situation and prevent any future abuse or mistreatment. But in Agar's life, as in ours, the world is neither fair nor just. Agar must return to Sarah, but she returns with a new sense of identity and empowerment that comes not from being an unjustified arrogance, but from divine affirmation. I'm sure that the relationship with Sarah and Abraham and Abraham and Sarah might have increased somewhat. Her future is not empty, but rather is filled with divine hope and purposes. She has seen God in the wilderness and returned as a changed person. Like Hagar, many of us, our situation and our circumstances haven't changed, but we can see God in our wilderness moment, and our purview or our viewpoint can change with more hope and purpose. Abraham and the community as trauma victims. Trauma studies prompt us to consider not only Sarah and Hagar as victims of victimizers, but also the role of Abraham and the community. Abraham is characterized throughout Genesis 16 as passive. He follows Sarah's initial directive to sleep with his servant, and when conflict arises, he does not intervene. He passed the buck back to her. Yet we would do well to remember that Abraham is a witness of trauma within his own family structure. Abraham is personally affected by Sarah's infertility and unfulfilled divine promises, and his passiveness in the conflict between Sarah and Hagar is reflected by the community, which also neglects to protect Hagar or to intervene. We may criticize Abraham for not intervening, but we may also understand his action as a typical response to the challenges that trauma and shame present in a society and its bystanders, who are often deeply affected by witnessing the trauma endured by others, but unsure how to respond. This is Abraham's child. I'm sure it was difficult for him to be in a position to choose between his wife and his child. Remarkably, however, in Genesis 16, we see an acknowledgement of Hagar's experience. Her story is commemorated by the community in the naming of the well. The community thus retains memory of Hagar's trauma experience in a positive way as a symbol that serves a reminder of her divine encounter. This acts to give the traumatic experience of abuse and the fight response new meaning. It serves as a way of the community to partially redeem itself and bring justice to Hagar. The community that failed to protect Hagar now publicly recognized her value as one who may be foreign servant, but who has encountered the living God in a dramatic and personal experience. Abraham also participated in Hagar's process of healing and confirming the divine encounter when he names the child Ishmael, indicating his acknowledgement of an obedience to Hagar's divine instruction. Again, Hagar returned to the abusive situation, but the dynamic have changed. She has new sense of identity and worth through her divine encounter. She's now a more humbled person. She has hope for the future through the divine birth announcement, and she has been affirmed by the communal and divine acknowledgement of her painful experience. So how do we learn from this trauma? It is reasonable to infer that Hagar has retold the narrative of her divine encounter to the community. By retelling the story, she's able to regain a sense of dignity and reclaim her history by framing the trauma experience in her own terms. By retelling her story, she demonstrates that the victimization no longer paralyzes her. Because we can encounter Sarah and Hagar's story in the biblical text, we can enter into what Wendy Williams described as dynamic process of interaction, where we as listeners and readers can connect to the biblical text through a relatedness and recognition of the other. This in turn enables us to see the story is as much a journey as an arrival, wherein listening becomes an active and resourceful opportunity to become forever changed. Viewing the biblical text through the perspective of trauma and its effects can equip us to apply the text with our experience of trauma or with other victims that we meet every day in our day-to-day life. Hagar's plight, for instance, is similar to what is happening in many places every day. We see her as a refugee, as someone who is sexually exploited, and as someone who then becomes an aggressor. And finally, we see her fleeing her abuser. These are relative life situations. Likewise, trauma victims tend to go back to their abusers. We find answers to painful experiences in this passage. Yahweh does see the pain of Hagar experience just like how he sees your pain and responds to you. For trauma victims who feel forsaken by God and abandoned by their communities, this is a powerful story of reassurance and hope that God sees you. He sees your pain and your circumstances. Her story does not necessarily conclude with a happy ending, but is nevertheless one of victory and empowerment. Hagar demonstrates that amidst of suffering, we can be empowered by the presence and affirmation of God. Understanding the effect of trauma and shame may also inspire a more compassionate view of Sarah. Though her abuse of Agar is inappropriate and inexcusable, we may characterize Sarah not only as an aggressor and victimizer, but also a broken character as a woman who herself is a victim of the traumatic, shameful experience of infertility and childlessness, despite the divine hope given to her husband. Retelling this biblical narrative can help us to learn as a community. We often fail to protect members of our community from trauma and shame. And this story shows that when a community fails to protect one of their members, there is redemption in acknowledging the suffering of trauma victims and in celebrating their triumph over trauma and redefinition as a person of worth. We witness this every day. And as a community, we too need to be empathetic in the way we deal with each other's shame and trauma. Dear Heavenly Father, I pray that someone will be blessed, someone will be encouraged this morning. There's so many people who are still living in there as victimizers and victims and in situation of traumatic encounters. But Lord, I pray that someone may find the courage this morning to even walk away from their situation. That someone this morning will recognize that you have seen them. You have not abandoned them in their shame. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Forgive me. I know it was a bit long, but we needed to keep the story together.